Hello everyone, my name is Adam Wenneman and I'm here today to talk to you about modernizing municipal curb management. Given this is a parking conference and you're all attending a talk about the curbside, I'm guessing you all have a lot of thoughts about this. So instead of diving right into my presentation, the first thing I'm going to do is ask you some questions. I pasted a link in the chat, or you can use the QR code on the screen to get to a short survey, and I promise it's short, it's painless, and we'll come back to these responses after the presentation to discuss some of the things that you all have to say about the curbside. Okay, on to the presentation. Today I'm going to talk about just why the curbside is so important, how the curbside is changing, what challenges we're facing that traditional curbside management practices have not quite been able to solve, and finally, what I think cities can do to improve their curbside management practices to prepare for an uncertain future. So first, the curbside is important. The curbside is a critical piece of the transportation network and more generally of how cities work. A lot of our parking supply is represented by on-street spaces. Looking at just central business districts, which are often home to large downtown parking structures, we can say that on-street spaces contribute upwards of 20% of the total parking supply in Canadian municipalities. In some places like Saskatoon or St. John's, the curbside makes up nearly all of their parking supply downtown. Clearly, the curbside is a big part of the mix when it comes to serving existing and future parking demand. For any visual learners in the audience, in downtown Hamilton, there are just over 1,100 on-street spaces. If we gathered them all up and put them side by side, the on-street spaces in downtown Hamilton would cover an area equivalent to the size of 10 NHL-sized ice rinks. If you're more of a dollars person, here's one for you. If we had to build these spaces today as a parking structure and provide the same number of spaces as exist on the curbside, that parking structure in downtown Hamilton would cost about $44 million. Clearly, cities should be investing significant time and effort managing such a large asset. That said, the curbside is also a scarce and limited resource. It's a scarce resource in that in many places it is insufficient for the demands placed upon it. This is especially true in downtown urban areas where curb space is likely underpriced. It is a limited resource in that we're not likely to get any more of it. If anything, we've already surpassed peak curb, as road networks for most urban areas are already built out, and some cities, Barcelona and Paris for example, are beginning to repurpose roads for other uses like parks and community spaces on a permanent basis. This is not to say that redesignating roads and the associated curb space in favor of public space is a bad idea. The point is to highlight the fact that we'll have to be smarter about how we use the space that is still available if we want to create efficient curbsides in our cities. And we definitely want to create efficient curbsides, as curbside access is a critical piece of the last mile for goods movement. This is the final link in the supply chain that connects raw materials to the consumers of final goods and services. Maintaining efficiency in the supply chain is an important factor in contributing to the livability and prosperity of cities. Commercial vehicles already face significant challenges operating in cities. In Toronto alone, for example, commercial vehicles are issued around $30 million each year in parking fines. Given that goods movement is a low-margin, cost-competitive business, most of these costs are passed on straight to consumers, resulting in higher prices for goods and services. I think it's uncontroversial to say that if commercial vehicles in the future are unable to deliver groceries to stores or goods to homes and businesses in a relatively efficient manner, cities as we experience them today will not exist. And finally, parking is a revenue generator for cities. This chart from the Municipal benchmarking network shows that parking is revenue positive in Canadian municipalities. Even including off-street facilities, which are much more expensive to build and maintain, Canadian municipalities generate an average of $2 for every dollar they spend operating parking spaces. It's not uncommon for parking operations in major cities to generate millions of dollars in surplus revenue each year, which then goes to support the various services provided by municipal governments. As we'll touch on in a moment, curbside use is changing and shifting away from paid parking to various other uses. But the fact that many of these new uses, TNCs like Uber and Lyft for example, pay little or nothing for access to curb space means that they represent a significant risk to the financial sustainability of parking operations. So to recap, there's a lot of curbside to manage, but it's also a scarce and limited resource. Efficient curbside operations are critical in making cities work, and the curbside helps support everything that municipal governments do. If you weren't interested in the curbside before, I sure hope you are now. And if you are, you're not alone.
2020 has been a lot of things, and one of those things is the year of the curbside.
Next, curbside use is changing. The first parking meter was installed in Oklahoma City in 1935 as a means to manage parking demand and promote turnover of on-street spaces. Parking costs 5 cents an hour, or about $1.25 Canadian in 2020 dollars. So there's a good stat for you next time somebody complains about parking today being too expensive. For the next 75 years or so, use of the curbside remained basically the same. Paid parking on busy streets, cheaper free parking on less busy streets. Some taxi stands where they were needed, the occasional delivery zone. But over the past decade, a lot of things have changed, and as a result, we've seen a dramatic increase in demand for space at the curbside. 10 years ago, Uber was barely off the ground, and today, TNCs like Uber and Lyft complete around 14 million trips a day, or 5 billion trips per year. Some of these trips are replacing auto trips, which would have had a need for parking, but many are replacing trips which would have previously been made by walking, biking, or transit. The end result is a dramatically increased demand for space at the curb to facilitate pickups and drop-offs for these trips. E-commerce has grown substantially during this period as well. Amazon alone has grown their revenue by over 800% and now grosses $280 billion a year in revenue, reflecting billions and billions of deliveries. Entire categories of e-commerce have emerged. Meal kit providers like Fresh Food, grocery delivery services like Grocery Gateway, and Deliver Anything services like Instacart, which did not even exist, have exploded in popularity. 10 years ago, alternate uses for curb space were rare. Bike share services were small in comparison to their popularity today, and scooters were popular mostly as toys for kids. Parklets were less common, and few people would have jumped at the chance to take their meal on a curbside patio if you had made the offer. None of these uses were being given space along the curbside, but today all of them are increasingly common curbside sites. So the changing nature of the use of the curbside has led to demand for curb space to exceed the supply of curb space, leading to inefficient use. Things like commercial vehicles parking illegally, cruising for parking, and a fight between a growing number of users for a limited amount of space. And I would argue that this is due to a lack of information. First, due to a lack of information provided to drivers. The only way curbside regulations are communicated today are by street signs, which are sometimes obstructed or damaged, and in many cases can just be confusing, especially to drivers trying to interpret them
As they drive along looking for parking, trying not to slow down traffic too much.
Second, due to a lack of information accessible to municipalities. Currently, very few Canadian municipalities have a good understanding of their existing curb regulations. How many parking spaces do we have? What are the time span restrictions on those spaces? How well or poorly are our accessible parking permit spaces distributed? How do the answers to these questions change during construction? This is predominantly due to how these regulations are managed and how this information is stored. Many municipalities rely on bylaws, which are tedious to work with, while others rely on signage inventories or work order histories, which can be even more difficult to interpret and may be out of date or not reflect what was actually installed in the field. These are relatively inaccessible forms of storing this information. If cities had better information or better access to that information, they can make better planning decisions, enforce the regulations more efficiently, and share that information freely with other groups within the city to help improve curbside operations. These challenges get even trickier when dealing with short-term changes like during construction or special events. During the summer, many cities made adjustments to how they designated curb space to allow for more pickup and drop-off spaces, as well as to allow for social distancing while waiting in lines. But very few cities were able to effectively communicate what was changing and where these changes were taking place. Announcements were made, but were frequently limited to bulleted lists of general locations, with temporary signage being added in the field shortly thereafter. The end result was that the locations of these changes were largely unknown to the general public until they encountered them in person, and I can't imagine sharing this information internally went much more smoothly. Finally, looking further into the future, CAVs lack any sort of machine-readable information on curbside regulations. Instead, CAVs rely on their arrays of sensors and cameras in an attempt to interpret signs on the fly to understand whether they can park, stop, or stand at a location along the curb. Due to this reliance on signage, CAVs will encounter similar issues as human drivers around obstructed or damaged signs, or can even be tricked by fake signs intended to confuse them. So curbside use is evolving, but curbside management is stuck in the past. There are problems we're facing that existing curbside management processes can't really address because we can't get the information to users when and where they need it. So how can curbside management practices evolve? How can we solve this underlying problem? The first step in modern curb management is developing what I'll call a curb layer to better understand existing regulations. This curb layer is a machine-readable, geospatially referenced dataset. I know that's a mouthful, but what it really boils down to is getting the existing curb rules into a digital format that can be more easily mapped, managed, and shared. A simple way to think about it is GTFS for the curb. The same way GTFS provides transit information like stop locations, frequencies, and real-time bus locations, this digital curb layer would contain curbside information, like what the applicable regulation is, when that and other regulations apply, which users those regulations apply to and which are accepted, and what is the cost if there's paid parking available. The example on the slide here shows the structure of the CurbLR specification, developed by Shared Streets, a nonprofit project of the Open Transport Partnership. As in all things data related, we need standards and specifications, and I'm mentioning CurbLR here by name because it's an open specification intended to facilitate the use of curbside data wherever and however cities want to use it, without being locked in by vendor-specific data structures. At its core, a curb layer is bringing together information that is currently mostly inaccessible from municipal bylaws, signage inventories, work orders, and into a more structured format that can be easily mapped, managed, and shared. This curb layer is the key that opens the door to a wide range of modern curbside management solutions. Creating a curb layer may sound like a lot of work or duplication of effort of something you maybe kind of, sort of, somewhere already have. But getting started digitizing curbside regulations in a way that's really useful is not that difficult to do. We developed a number of ways to help cities digitize this information. We can build on existing signage inventories, digitize bylaw documents, or even drive around town and scan signs as we go. But probably the simplest place to get started is with another open source tool developed by Shared Streets called CurbWheel. CurbWheel consists of a standard curb measuring wheel connected to a Raspberry Pi, which is a simple single board computer, and a smartphone used to capture the images of the signs. The design, parts list, assembly instructions, and software is all open source and available on GitHub. And if circuit boards or soldering scares you, I can relate, but I promise it's simple. We've built and deployed a handful of these already with no issue. CurbWheel is great because the barrier to entry is really very low, so anyone with even just a little bit of interest and time on their hands can get started digitizing curbside regulations. With minimal post-processing, curbside regulations for entire downtown areas can be captured with high accuracy and minimal upfront cost. In our experience, these costs are on the magnitude of just $25 to $35 per curb kilometer. So once curbside regulation data is collected, cities need some way to view, manage, and analyze this data. CurbLR structured data can be converted to a shapefile and viewed in ArcGIS or QGIS, but there are some issues here. Existing GIS tools aren't great with manipulating time series data like curbside regulations, and shapefiles aren't a great data structure for curb segments with lots of overlapping segments. This is a complicating factor in managing digital curb data, as GIS platforms are widely used by municipalities today. But curb data is just a little bit too complex for existing GIS software to manage well. But that's okay, because there are a number of modern tools to help municipalities leverage this data. The example on the screen here is from CurbIQ, and there are a number of open source options as well developed by Shared Streets. These tools are useful because they can help leverage curbside regulation data to help municipalities quickly and easily answer questions that they have about their existing regulations, like how do the restrictions change on this segment throughout the day? Do our no parking restrictions make sense? Or even, how many parking spaces do we have within walking distance of a given location? One Canadian municipality we know of that has started to use these types of tools was able to identify a number of conflicts and gaps in their existing regulations that they didn't even know existed, as the regulation data they were drawing on before was not mappable or easy to work with. These tools can result in real savings. By making curbside regulation easier to understand and manage, city staff can significantly reduce the time it takes to check or update existing regulations as part of project work, which may impact the curbside. Consider many of the curbside dining programs implemented across Canada over the summer. How much time could have been saved if all that was required to implement a new pickup zone or curbside patio was a few clicks on a map rather than all the work required to cross-reference bylaws or dig into outdated signage inventories. This time could have been spent instead on higher value tasks. The last thing I'll mention on these tools is that I don't think they are just a technological solution in search of a problem. At their core, I think these tools can help municipalities look at how they're using public space and consider if those uses are equitable and just, and if not, help those cities make change. Finally, municipalities can implement methods to share this data with key stakeholders. The first group, as we mentioned, is city staff themselves or consultants that cities are working with. For example, planners who may be able to use curbside data analysis tools to help in studying the impacts of new active transportation facilities or dedicated transit improvements. The second group is the general public. Shoup famously estimated approximately 30% of traffic in dense urban areas was made up of vehicles just cruising for parking. We can debate the number, but even if that estimate is high by 100%, then providing better information to drivers as to where parking is available and helping them better plan their trips can have a meaningful impact in reducing VKT and emissions associated with cruising for parking. This could be done either via municipal mobile parking apps or through APIs established to share data with developers who can then include curbside regulation data and existing third-party applications. A third user group that would benefit from this information is made up of TNCs and commercial vehicle operators. These are two of the largest and fastest growing users of curb space, and today they pay almost nothing for that use. However, they do incur costs related to the curbside in the form of parking tickets, slower delivery times due to time spent searching for parking, and managing complaints from customers when their food arrives cold because the driver couldn't find parking. One could imagine a solution here whereby municipalities provide access to curbside regulation data on a per trip basis, say 10 cents per trip. This helps these users save time and reduce costs, while at the same time facilitating more efficient curbside operations and providing a new revenue stream to municipalities, who no longer would need to rely solely on paid parking to cover all of the costs related to operating the curb. And let's not forget about CAVs. By providing machine-readable curbside regulation data directly to vehicles, we can help CAVs navigate complex curbside environments and help make our curbside as safe and efficient as possible. So there are three things that I hope everyone takes away from this presentation, and I'll repeat them again here. The curbside is important, the curbside is changing, and we need to prepare for the future. By creating digital curb regulation data and implementing modern curbside management tools, cities can better understand their existing curbside regulations, identifying gaps and conflicts they may not even know that they have. They can better communicate those regulations to users, reducing cruising for parking and unnecessary VKT and emissions. They can help themselves work more efficiently by providing a common source of easily accessible information on curbside regulations. They can monetize non-paying users, maintaining financial sustainability. And finally, they can adapt the curbside rapidly to new uses if or when big changes are needed, ensuring they're prepared for an uncertain future.
So that's my presentation. Thank you everyone for your attention. I look forward to your questions and further discussion around this topic.